Echo Glen, a battle for the lake. I've never been the kind of man who raises his voice unless the stakes truly demand it. Retired now with 3 decades as a water systems engineer behind me, I thought I'd spend my days watching the lake shimmer in the morning light from the back porch, coffee in hand, dog at my feet. That lake wasn't just a feature of the neighborhood, it was the very reason I chose this plot of land nearly 25 years ago. I knew its origins, its limits, and its risks. I helped design the runoff channels and worked on the original conservation permits when this community was just an ambitious layout on an architect's desk. To most people here in Echo Glen, the lake was decorative, a postcard scene. But to me, it was a fragile, living organism, part of a larger watershed that threaded its way down into the valley and into the lives of every farmer, every gardener, every child who drank from a glass of water here. I'd seen what happened to these places when people forgot that. I'd seen the damage. That's why when the Homeowners Association started tossing around phrases like dredging for aesthetic enhancement and expanding the lakeside amenity zones, my pulse didn't just quicken, it spiked. It wasn't just idiocy, it was dangerous. The first time I brought it up at a meeting, I was polite. I stood up with my hands folded in front of me, nodded to Marjorie Klein, the HOA president, with her sharp pantsuits and sharper voice, and tried to reason with them. I cited runoff coefficients, sediment stratification, shoreline erosion risks. I could see them glaze over in real time. "Thank you, Mr. West," Marjorie had said curtly. "We'll take your concerns under advisement." That was code for "we'll bury it in the minutes and move on." And they did. A week later, a flyer arrived in every mailbox. Echo Glen Beautification Project, rejuvenating our lakefront for future enjoyment. There were glossy mock-ups of an expanded boardwalk, paddle boat rentals, and a new observation deck with decorative lighting. Not a single word about permits, not a single word about the watershed study the original developers had to submit in triplicate just to break ground 25 years ago. I stormed down to the HOA office. Well stormed is generous. I walked with purpose. I'm 68, and my knees aren't what they used to be. Still, I arrived with a folder of printed documents ready to make a point. They wouldn't let me in. Meetings by appointment, only Mr. West, the receptionist, chirped without even looking up. "Then make one," I said flatly. The appointment they gave me was for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks by then, the dredging could have already begun. I knew how these things worked. They'd bring in contractors early, try to finish before winter, rain season claim it was just routine maintenance. So I reached out to an old contact in the County Environmental Protection Office, Diane Holloway, someone I trusted, someone who used to call me when junior engineers needed help with hydro reports. I sent her the HOA flyer, my notes, and a topographical analysis I'd done from my own backyard with a basic drone scan. Her response was swift. "This violates multiple sections of the Lakebed Disturbance Protection Act. If they act without permits, it's a finable offense, maybe even criminal negligence, if it causes downstream damage." It should have reassured me. But I'd seen what a determined HOA board could do when they felt powerful. And Marjorie Klein had more than just power, she had vanity. She didn't just want to expand the lakefront for community value. She wanted to leave a legacy. There was history here. Her husband Norman had been on the original board of the HOA when they first established it in the early 2000s. He'd always treated me with a wary smile, respectful, but distant. When he passed, Marjorie stepped into his shoes like she'd been waiting for the moment. She saw me not as a neighbor, not even as a concerned expert, but as an obstacle. 2 days after I contacted the county, a truck pulled up by the lake. I watched through binoculars from my second-floor window. 2 men got out, one with a measuring pole, the other taking notes. Surveyors, likely prepping for machinery. I recorded everything. I took photos. Time-stamped the license plates, sent it all to Diane. She told me she'd forward it to the permitting office and that they'd notify the HOA that any construction would require an immediate cease and desist. But I'd been in government long enough to know notices and enforcement are 2 very different things. That night, I sat on my porch long after the sun dipped behind the hills. My German Shepherd Hank rested at my feet, ears twitching at every frog and cricket. The moon reflected in the water, silver and still. I knew that lake's moods. knew when it murmured and when it threatened, and I could feel it then. It was balanced on a knife's edge. This wasn't just about a misguided HOA project. It was about what happens when small people with small minds get their hands on systems too large to comprehend. They'd dug into something they didn't understand, and they'd keep digging unless someone stopped them. And that someone had to be me. Because while everyone else just saw a lake, I saw the future drowning right in front of them. It didn't take long for the trucks to multiply. What started with 2 men and a measuring rod soon escalated to full-site staging. Flatbeds rolled in before dawn, carrying excavation equipment that roared to life before most neighbors had even poured their morning coffee. Yellow caution tape orange cones and crude signs that read "Authorized personnel only" appeared along the lakeside path. No mention of city approval. No permits visible. To the average neighbor, it looked official enough to shrug off. But to me, it was a crime in broad daylight. A slow-motion disaster with steel teeth and blind ambition. I walked down to the lake that morning with Hank at my side, a folder of documents tucked under my arm, and a level of restrained fury I hadn't felt since my days dealing with corrupt subcontractors on a dam project in the 90s. One of the site managers, a young man in an Echo Glen branded vest, stepped toward me when I crossed the perimeter tape. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is an active job site." I met his eyes. "Do you have the permit number posted?" He blinked. "Permit?" I held out the document. "This is the 2002 watershed report filed with the county that states explicitly no mechanical dredging without updated hydrology modeling and authorization from the Floodplain Regulatory Office." He glanced down, unsure of what to say. That's when Marjorie Klein's voice sliced through the air like a razor through silk. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Daniel." She strode over, in her signature tan pantsuit and oversized sunglasses, hair perfectly set, like she'd just stepped out of a boardroom in Manhattan, instead of a neighborhood with coyotes and compost bins. Her tone was coated in condescension. "You're harassing the crew again," she said sweetly, loud enough for the workers to hear. "Do you realize how disruptive you're being?" I didn't look away. "You're going to get someone hurt, or worse." Marjorie's smile faltered. "The board has already voted. It was a unanimous decision. The lakefront will be safer and more enjoyable for all residents once we remove the excessive sediment buildup." "There is no sediment problem," I replied sharply. "What you're calling excess is part of the natural retention layer. You strip that, you destabilize the entire floodplain." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You've been retired for how long now? Long enough to know what a disaster looks like before it happens." Her eyes narrowed. "If you continue to interfere, we'll have to involve legal counsel. We've warned you." I smiled then, just a little. "Good. I'd love to speak to your lawyer, especially when the county fines you 6 figures and FEMA gets wind of it." I turned and walked back toward my house, pulse steady but rising. Hank trotted along quietly, sensing the shift in my body. He always did. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Back home, I called Diane again. "They've started," I told her. "Full excavation equipment, no permits, not even signage." I could hear her typing rapidly on the other end. "You're kidding." "No. And Marjorie Klein is treating it like a done deal." "I need you to escalate." "I'll flag it for the regional enforcement team," she said. "But you know how it is. Response time is slow if there's no immediate threat." "There's a lake at risk," I snapped, "and the rain season is 6 weeks away." "Let me see what I can do," she said, quieter now. After we hung up, I started building a paper trail. Every morning, I logged activity from my upstairs window, time-stamped photos, sound recordings of equipment notes about oil slicks I saw creeping into the water. The dredgers weren't even using silt curtains. It was amateur hour on a dangerous stage. But the residents, they just kept walking their dogs and sipping coffee like nothing was happening. Some even waved at the workers. The HOA had already sent out a glossy newsletter claiming this improvement would raise home values by up to 12%. Most people were too distracted to care, until the fish died. It started with a handful bluegill and smallmouth bass floating near the shallows. I found 3 of them on my morning walk and took photos. By the next day, it was dozens. They were pulling nutrients from the wrong water layer, now churning up anaerobic sludge that suffocated aquatic life. I submitted the evidence to the city's environmental complaint portal. No response. That Friday, Marjorie held a wine and cheese event on the lawn near the lake, a ribbon cutting for what she called Phase 2 Lakeside Transformation. I showed up in a blue windbreaker and boots holding a stack of printed satellite imagery from the last 2 weeks. As she posed with board members and a big pair of golden scissors, I passed the pages out to neighbors one by one. Some laughed, some ignored me. But some, especially the older ones who lived here before the HOA, grew into a mini-government, took the papers, read them, and frowned. That night, I got an anonymous email. They're storing the debris in the West Basin. It's seeping into the groundwater. Thought you should know. No name, no signature, but I knew where to go. The next morning, I drove my truck around the back side of the lake, where the trails ended and the maintenance road curled into the woods. I hiked the last few hundred feet through brush, camera in hand. And there it was, a fenced-off clearing with dump piles stacked 8 feet high. No liners, no containment, and less than 100 yards from the marshy inlet that fed the town's wetland corridor. They weren't just dredging, they were dumping. I emailed Diane again. I attached the photo's GPS coordinates, a rough estimate of soil displacement. I CC'd 2 local reporters from the Echo Sentinel. Then I waited. It took 3 more days before the first real consequence arrived, a temporary stop work order taped to the HOA office door. But by then, they'd already destabilized the western spill embankment. The cracks had started. I could feel it in my bones, literally. The soil shifted differently under my boots near the dock. Water levels no longer receded at night like they used to. The lake wasn't breathing right, but Marjorie, she doubled down. Sent out a community-wide email calling the order bureaucratic overreach and urged residents to sign a petition against the county's obstruction of progress. She called me out by name. Certain individuals are attempting to sabotage our improvements with outdated science and fear tactics. Echo Glen will not be bullied by pessimists. I sat at my desk reading her email as the rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier, soaking into the already disturbed earth. I looked out at the lake, and for the first time, I felt it stir. The first emergency email I sent was ignored. It was addressed to the county's Floodplain Safety Division subject line, in all caps, unauthorized dredging evidence of structural destabilization. I attached every photo chart and time-stamped drone video I had. The body of the email read like a siren wail, not just for Echo Glen, but for anyone living downstream. By then, I had already documented sediment levels dropping faster than the water table could adjust. The removal of the clay silt barrier, a critical buffer against sudden hydrostatic pressure changes, had left the western embankment vulnerable. This was textbook hydrology. Any civil engineer worth their salt would have red flagged the site. But the county was slow to respond. Maybe it was politics. Maybe it was burnout. Or maybe it was just another case of a retirement-age homeowner being dismissed as an alarmist. I'd seen it happen before, experts ignored because they didn't have a PR department behind them. So I escalated. I sent the full dossier to a friend of mine, Evelyn Weller, who worked with a regional environmental watchdog group. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a bulldog with an archive of environmental litigation successes. She called me 10 minutes after I sent the files. "Dan," she said, "this is not just bad planning. This is criminal negligence." "I know," I replied. "I want to file an injunction, but I need hard evidence that runoff is breaching containment. Soil samples, water tests, something indisputable. I'll get it." The next morning, I took my field kit, pH meter sample vials, nitrate testing strips, and hiked the trail around the north inlet. Rain had softened the soil, and I could already see early signs of unnatural flow. Small rivulets where none had existed. Silt where there should have been gravel. I collected everything. That night, the HOA sent out another community bulletin. "Dear residents, We are aware of several recent rumors regarding the lake beautification project. Rest assured, all activities are fully compliant with neighborhood improvement guidelines. HOA Executive Board. Not a word about permits. Not a word about the stop work order. Worse still, the equipment stayed. The workers were back the next morning, only this time they worked faster longer into the night with portable floodlights. I knew what they were doing, trying to finish before any enforcement action could physically stop them. A rush job on a wounded lake. I filed a formal complaint with the State Department of Water Resources. I called the City Council liaison, who barely remembered my name, from the last time I'd spoken at a planning meeting 3 years ago. I even tried calling the HOA's legal counsel, a real estate firm 2 towns over with zero environmental expertise. Their secretary refused to transfer the call. That's when I made a decision I would make it public. I uploaded the drone footage to a private YouTube channel, no narration, just raw data. The video showed sediment plumes flowing like smoke beneath the surface, excavators grinding inches from the vegetative buffer zone, dump trucks spilling tailings into unauthorized zones. The visual evidence was indisputable. Then I posted the link to the neighborhood message board. That's when things changed. The next morning I woke up to a dozen voicemails. Neighbors, the same ones who'd ignored me before, suddenly wanted answers. Is that really our lake? Why is there green foam near my garden runoff? My dog's been sick after swimming. Then came the media. A junior reporter from Echo Sentinel, Brittany Tran, reached out for a quote. She had seen the video link posted anonymously on Reddit. Within hours, she was parked outside my house with a recorder and notepad. I'm not interested in making enemies, I told her. I just want people to understand what's happening. What would you say is the biggest threat right now? She asked. I pointed toward the lake. Rain. That lake is not holding the way it should. And if we get a flash storm, the water won't rise. It'll move, fast, unpredictably. And downhill from here is HOA headquarters and then 35 family homes. She blinked. You think they're in danger? I think they already are. They just don't know it yet. She printed the article the next day with the headline, Retired Engineer Warns of Lake Disaster HOA Under Scrutiny. Marjorie lost her mind. That same afternoon, I received a cease and desist letter hand-delivered to my mailbox. It accused me of defamation, trespassing, and violating HOA digital conduct rules. It was 3 pages of empty threats wrapped in legal jargon. But I knew what it meant. They were scared. They should have been. Because 2 days later, the first sinkhole opened. It was small, no more than 3 feet wide, but it opened less than 20 yards from the HOA office's foundation. Maintenance staff cordoned it off with plastic tape and orange cones. They called it a natural soil depression in their email. I called it what it was, the first crack in a dam about to burst. I submitted the sinkhole data to Evelyn. She forwarded it to the state engineer's office with a formal declaration, evidence of accelerating ground destabilization due to unlawful dredging practices by unlicensed agents under the direction of HOA Board of Echo Glen. The storm hit 3 days later. Not a hurricane, not a monsoon, just a strong Pacific cold front typical for early fall with sustained rain for 36 hours. But the lake had changed. It no longer absorbed the water. It rejected it. By midnight, the water had reached the footpath behind the HOA building. By 3 a.m., it started pouring into the maintenance basement. And by dawn, the lake took what it had warned us about all along. It took their headquarters. The foundation cracked with a sound that echoed like thunder. I watched from my upstairs window as the far corner of the building sank into the mud, pulling with it an entire storage room and half of the executive meeting hall. Computers, filing cabinets, a vending machine, gone. Hank whined beside me. I reached down and scratched behind his ear. I whispered. God knows I tried. Down at the lake, HOA board, members screamed. Some waded into the water to pull things out. Marjorie stood on the walkway, arms outstretched as if ordering the flood to obey her. It didn't. Because that's the thing about nature. You can ignore science. You can ignore permits. You can ignore warnings. But nature doesn't care. It just responds. In the aftermath of the flood, the HOA tried to put on a brave face, but it was nothing more than a soaked cardboard mask, barely holding together under the weight of public scrutiny. The damage to their headquarters wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Their center of power. The very space from which they'd issued threats, fines, and beautification plans was now a muddy crater with a sunken roof and a floating printer lodged in the reeds. I stood at the edge of the lake that morning, boots deep in spongy ground, a thermos of black coffee in hand. Hank trotted alongside me, keeping a cautious distance from the soggy shoreline. It smelled of churned earth gasoline and panic. Yellow caution tape flapped in the breeze around the sunken building. A temporary steel fence had been hastily installed, but it was crooked and already leaning like it knew it was part of a losing battle. Marjorie wasn't out that morning. Neither were the other board members. They'd retreated into silence, probably trying to figure out who to blame, who to sacrifice, and how to reframe a preventable disaster into a freak act of God. But I knew better. And so did the town. In the days that followed, the real consequences began to roll in. First came the engineering inspection report from the county. I got my hands on it through Diane, who emailed it with a single line. You were right, all of it. The report was scathing. It confirmed that the dredging had removed critical layers of sediment that acted as a natural filter and pressure buffer. It highlighted how the removal process done without proper modeling had weakened the load-bearing integrity of the surrounding embankment, especially on the southwestern edge where the headquarters once stood. They even included drone images of pooling water behind the remaining facility walls, clearly marked danger zone, subject to further collapse if rainfall persists. I printed out the report, 3-hole punched it, and slid it into the growing binder I kept on my dining room table. Evidence. Irrefutable. I wasn't going to let this become another one of those neighborhood disasters quietly swept under the rug by a restructuring board. But the worst part? They weren't done. 2 days after the inspection report was released, I saw them again, contractors. Not the same company as before, but new trucks, new faces, and the same damn mission salvage and repair. The HOA had authorized a second phase of work to stabilize the shoreline without waiting for environmental clearance. They were now dredging in reverse, scooping mud and backfilling embankments using crushed limestone and gravel without geotextile liners. I watched a backhoe dump literal rocks into the lake like they were filling potholes on a county road. I'd had enough. I walked down with my binder, stepped right past the caution tape, and flagged the site supervisor, a man named Kurt, with forearms like barrels and eyes too tired to care. This is a documented federal waterway now under active investigation, I told him. He looked up from his clipboard. And you are Daniel West, former chief hydrologist at Carter Valley. And if you don't shut this site down, I'll have the EPA here by morning. He stared at me for a long beat. We're just here to fix what the last guys messed up. There is no fixing this with dump gravel, I said. You're compacting the water table and blocking subterranean relief veins. That flood, that was the start. You keep pushing, you'll trigger a full basin slide. Kurt didn't argue. He called someone, probably his boss. 10 minutes later, the machines powered down and the crew began rolling up cables. Temporary pause. I called Evelyn. They're trying to bury the evidence, I told her. They've switched contractors. Same violation. Different name. I'll file for an emergency injunction tonight, she said. We've got more than enough. But you should know they've started a counter-campaign. Of course they have. She sighed. They're claiming this was sabotage, that someone tampered with the lake structure to make the HOA look bad. They haven't named you yet, but... I'm ready, I said. And I was. I'd lived through smear campaigns, before corporate ones, even governmental ones, back when I'd blown the whistle on a faulty reservoir bypass in Idaho. I'd watched men in suits destroy reputations with half-truths and press releases, but this was different. This was my lake, my home. That week, Echo Glen became a war zone of rumor and blame. Flyers were slipped into mailboxes accusing me of tampering with the lake's natural balance for political gain. A fake social media page appeared under the title Protect Echo Progress, filled with edited videos and manipulated quotes from old HOA meetings. They underestimated me. I posted the full inspection report online, unedited with every name and violation highlighted in yellow. I released full drone footage with time-stamped overlays. I even uploaded archived footage from 2003, showing the original survey team, including a younger version of myself, explaining the structural importance of the lake's sediment layers. The effect was immediate. The same neighbors who had doubted me just weeks ago now stood beside me. We held a community forum at the local library. Over 70 residents showed up, the largest gathering Echo Glen had seen that wasn't a 4th of July picnic. I presented a slideshow, answered every question, and distributed copies of the EPA's own preliminary findings. At the end of the night, an elderly woman in the front row, Mrs. Belinda Caraway, who'd lived by the lake since before the HOA even existed, stood up and said, "We trusted them to manage this place. But we forgot that power doesn't make people smarter, it just makes them louder." The room erupted in applause. The next day, a group of residents formally submitted a petition to suspend the HOA board pending investigation. That same morning, the mayor's office contacted me directly. "We'd like you to join a task force to assess long-term risk and recovery planning for Echo Glen Lake." The message read. I said yes without hesitation. Later that week, I stood again at the lake's edge, this time with environmental consultants, county engineers, and reporters in tow. We surveyed the wreckage. We talked about proper remediation. We mapped out a plan not just to fix the lake, but to protect it for generations. No more dredging, no more secret meetings, no more HOA arrogance. It wasn't over yet. There would be lawsuits, insurance nightmares, and probably a few more hit pieces against me. But the tide had turned. This wasn't about HOA authority anymore. It was about what happens when people remember that their voices, their land, still matter, and that nature always gets the last word. It began with a vibration. At first, I thought it was just the heavy trucks. A dull rhythmic tremor beneath my feet, while I stood out by the dock clipboard in hand, inspecting the sediment levels near the retaining wall. But then, I felt it again, more subtle this time. Almost like the earth itself exhaled beneath me and didn't fully settle back. I dropped to one knee, pressed my palm against the damp soil. It wasn't just movement, it was displacement. I stood slowly, looked around the shoreline, and my eyes caught it immediately, a barely perceptible shift in the angle of the bank to the left of the old boat ramp. The slope had changed. Not by much, just a few degrees, but enough to know that water had begun saturating the subsurface layers beyond safe load capacity. The dredging hadn't just destabilized the shore, it had unlocked something deeper, something the lake had been holding back for decades, maybe longer. I took photos, logged the GPS coordinates. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to town and paid for a private soil test. The technician, a young man with rings in his ears and a lab coat too clean to inspire confidence, raised an eyebrow at the sample. "This from near Echo Glen," I nodded. He swirled the vial and frowned. "Looks like anaerobic seep, high sulfur traces, probably from old decomposed matter trapped in the lower levels, which shouldn't be surfacing," I said. "Definitely not. Not unless someone stirred the pot." I left with a manila envelope full of bad news. News the HOA would ignore if I emailed it, so I brought it in person. I walked into the temporary office they'd set up inside the community center gym, long folding tables, borrowed laptops, and a stack of drying documents rescued from the flood. Marjorie sat at the far end with 2 other board members whispering into her phone. She saw me and sighed theatrically. "Mr. West, unless this is urgent, it is." I dropped the envelope in front of her. Sulfur gas emissions, soil destabilization, proof that anaerobic layers are surfacing due to your dredging. One of the board members reached for the papers, flipping through them with shallow concern. "This is all very technical," he muttered. "We'll have someone take a look." "No," I cut in. "You'll stop the backfilling immediately. You're sealing in methane pockets without ventilation. Do you have any idea what happens when pressure builds beneath that kind of mass?" Marjorie arched an eyebrow. "Is this another one of your doomsday predictions?" I stared at her. "It's a matter of time, Marjorie, not imagination. You've stripped the lake bed's capacity to regulate its own water pressure. Now the storm runoff is trapped underneath the artificial fill. The next rain won't flood the surface, it'll explode from underneath it." They laughed. Not loudly, not with mirth, but with that dismissive professional kind of laughter that people use to shield themselves from responsibility. "Thank you for your input," she said finally. "But unless this comes with a court order, we'll proceed as scheduled." I left before I said something I'd regret. That night, the wind shifted. It carried with it a foul metallic scent like eggs and gasoline. Hank wouldn't go near the shoreline. He whimpered when I walked close tail-tucked, nose down. That dog had better instincts than half the HOA board combined. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Belinda Carraway. "Daniel," she said in a hushed voice, "there's water bubbling out from my lawn." I drove over immediately. Her property sat on the southern bend, where the lake's natural overflow had once drained through a buried culvert into the wetlands beyond. It was blocked now thanks to HOA improvements. What I saw on her lawn turned my blood cold. Dark, foamy water seeping up through the ground in irregular pulses. Not from rain, not from sprinkler lines, from pressure. I dropped to one knee again like I had at the dock. Planted my hand on the grass. It was warm. That was when I knew the lake was no longer just threatening. It was preparing. I issued one last official report, my third in 2 weeks, and submitted it to the city. I called Diane, forwarded the footage to Evelyn, and sent the test results to Brittany Tran, the young reporter from the Sentinel. Then I waited. And waited. Until it rained again. It wasn't even a heavy storm, just a steady, consistent drizzle that felt like a warning, soft and mournful. But by the second hour, I saw it the western edge of the lake began to rise beneath the shoreline. Not over it, not around it, under it. Water wasn't flowing in, it was forcing itself out. Panic hit the HOA fast. The gym turned office, lost power within the hour. The computers shorted. Residents began reporting water rising in crawl spaces, sump pumps failing. Then came the cracking. Not thunder, not trees. Foundation slabs. One family, the Dryers, barely made it out in time before their back porch caved in. A sinkhole had opened right under their grill. Emergency services were dispatched, but it wasn't enough. The system that had once protected this neighborhood was broken, ripped out, and replaced with quick fixes and shortcuts. They'd spent all their money, turning the lake into a photo op, and now it was coming back for them. That night, I stood on my back deck as the lake pulsed like a living creature breathing, rising, reclaiming. I didn't smile. I didn't whisper, "I told you so." There was no satisfaction in being right when your neighbors were wading through sewage and mud. But I also wasn't surprised, because I'd seen it all before in remote parts of the state where companies tried to cheat the rules dredge too deep seal too fast. It always ended the same way. Collapse. In the days that followed, the state sent in a task force. Evelyn filed for a formal injunction. The mayor declared a local state of emergency, and the Echo Glen HOA, they issued a press release. Unforeseen geological activity. That's what they called it. Not negligence. Not arrogance, just geology. But the town knew better. The signs had been there, and they'd ignored them all. It started just after midnight. I had gone to bed early that evening, not from peace, but from exhaustion. The kind that settles into your joints and behind your eyes, not physical tiredness, but the weight of having watched your warnings turn into reality, while people still clung to denial. Hank, ever faithful, had curled up by the bedroom door, tail twitching with every distant gust. Rain tapped softly at the windows, steady and rhythmic. Nothing dramatic. Just the usual kind of drizzle that lulled the neighborhood into thinking everything would be fine. Until the sirens. The first was faint, barely audible, over the sound of rain. Then came the second, closer and sustained. By the time I flung the covers off and reached for the window, the orange glow of emergency lights reflected off the slick rising surface of the lake below. But it wasn't just high water, creeping toward the homes. It was the lake itself moving. I threw on jeans and a flannel shirt, grabbed my field radio and flashlight, and slipped on my boots, heart pounding. Hank was already alert, nose to the door. He let out a low growl like he knew this night was different. We stepped outside into a world that no longer followed the rules. The once firm ground behind my property squished underfoot. The retaining wall near the dock had vanished, swallowed whole. My neighbor's canoe, normally secured to the fence, drifted silently through the reeds like a ghost ship. I waded forward, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the lake's surface. It was no longer a lake. It was a surge, and it was rising fast. By the time I made it to the old gravel path that led toward the clubhouse remains, I could see the water pouring into the lowest part of the neighborhood. The remnants of the HOA headquarters, what little was left after the partial collapse, were already submerged waist-deep in muddy floodwater. Office chairs floated in slow circles. Bits of insulation clung to the trees like spiderwebs. And in the middle of it all, standing in knee-deep water with a flashlight above her head, was Marjorie Klein. I'll never forget the look on her face, eyes wide mouth, slack hair, flattened against her forehead by the rain. She looked not just afraid, but lost, like someone who had finally glimpsed the truth of their insignificance. For all her posturing, all her defiance, she now stood in the ruins of her own authority. I called out. "Marjorie," she turned slowly, flashlight beam landing on my chest. "You need to get out of there," I shouted over the rushing water. "It's not supposed to be this bad," she yelled back, as if her disbelief might somehow lessen the current. I waded in carefully, step by step, feeling for the ground. Hank barked behind me, pacing the edge of the trail, refusing to follow. Smart dog. When I reached her, she didn't resist. She was shaking, soaked through. I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward higher ground. Behind us, the water shifted again, rising another foot in minutes. The pressure was increasing, probably due to blocked culverts downstream. By the time we got to the community garden, we weren't alone. Flashlights blinked through the trees as other residents stumbled through the dark, clutching pets bags, children. A few of them stared at Marjorie, with expressions that said everything they hadn't dared to say in the last 2 months. I gathered the group under the pavilion, one of the few raised structures still dry, and took inventory. 16 residents, 3 children, 4 dogs, 1 HOA president, in complete shock. I keyed my radio. "This is West. I've got 16 here at the North Pavilion near Garden Lot B. Floodwaters rising fast, at least 3 feet at the low point. We need evacuation support now." The response crackled through moments later. "Roger that. Emergency crews are rerouting from Eastgate. ETA 25 minutes. Hold position." 25 minutes felt like eternity when you're watching your neighborhood drown. Some of the residents huddled together, murmuring prayers or comforting each other. Others stared out into the dark, watching their yards disappear beneath murky water. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. This flood wasn't an act of nature alone. It was man-made, engineered by arrogance and wrapped in HOA letterhead. I caught Marjorie glancing at me once. "You warned me," she said quietly. I didn't answer. What was there to say? This wasn't the time for "I told you so." This was the time for triage, for resilience, for gathering the pieces after the dam breaks. When the emergency vehicles finally arrived, their headlights pierced the mist like beacons. Firefighters and sheriff's deputies began guiding residents to higher ground, some to nearby homes on the bluff, others to waiting trucks at the school parking lot. I stayed behind until everyone else had moved. Hank never took his eyes off me. Good boy. As I walked back to my property, now half flooded, I stopped by the edge of the lake and looked out across what used to be the western embankment. It was gone. Not eroded, not cracked, gone. The water had cut through it like a hot knife, through butter pouring into the adjacent gully and tearing apart everything in its path. There was no way to rebuild that section, not without millions in engineering and restoration. And even then, it wouldn't be the same. This lake had changed. And so had the people around it. The next morning, under gray skies and the whir of news helicopters overhead, I stood before a FEMA field agent and a crew of civil engineers. We charted out what needed to be done: soil testing, environmental remediation, potential relocation of infrastructure, rebuilding of runoff channels. One of the younger agents turned to me and said, "We're going to need someone who knows the system, someone with history. You built part of it, right?" I nodded. "You willing to advise us on this?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. Yes. That afternoon, while volunteers passed out water bottles and contractors installed temporary barriers, I saw Marjorie again sitting alone on a plastic folding chair beneath a tarp. Her hair was pinned up with a pencil, her clothes damp and wrinkled, her clipboard gone. She looked up at me tired. "Do you think we'll ever get it back?" she asked. I followed her gaze to the lake. "No," I said honestly. "But we can make something better if we do it right this time." She nodded slowly, almost like a child. And then for the first time since the flood, she said it. "I'm sorry." I nodded once and walked away. Some mistakes don't get fixed with apologies, but they can still be turned into lessons if you're willing to stop talking and start listening. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Echo Glen would do now. Because when the lake rose that night, it didn't just wash away their buildings, it washed away their illusions. In the days that followed the flood, the air around Echo Glen shifted not just from moisture or the sour scent of wet insulation, but from something heavier, the unmistakable weight of accountability finally catching up. People weren't whispering anymore. They were speaking loudly in crowded meetings, online forums, and angry calls to the mayor's office. And for once, they weren't pointing fingers at me. They were pointing at the HOA board. I watched it unfold from my front porch like a long-delayed thunderclap. Marjorie Klein and her once tight circle of power began to fray at the edges. First, it was Karen Dills, the treasurer, who quietly removed herself from the board chat group and failed to show up for the first post-flood emergency meeting. Then came Victor Malley, the facilities coordinator, who went on local radio and stammered through a half apology before blaming miscommunications and misfiled documents for the dredging. But the most public unraveling came in the form of a town hall organized by residents, not the board. It was held at the community elementary school, where the auditorium had been hastily rearranged with folding chairs, extension cords, and posters printed with phrases like, "We deserve the truth," and "Where did our dues go?" I sat in the back row with Hank curled at my feet binder in my lap. I had no plans to speak, unless I had to. I'd already done enough talking. This time I was here to listen to the watch if the people of Echo Glen had truly woken up. The place was packed. More than 200 residents, some standing along the walls. You could feel the tension buzz in the room like static. When Marjorie finally appeared at the front, flanked by 2 remaining board members, there wasn't a single clap, not even a polite cough. She approached the microphone with the same professional posture I'd seen her use at ribbon cuttings and HOA barbecues, but her voice had lost its bite. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to address your concerns and provide clarity regarding the Lakefront Improvement Project and the unfortunate flooding." Someone stood up in the 4th row. "You mean the illegal dredging and the avoidable destruction of our homes?" Applause. Marjorie tried to recover. "Let's please remember to stay civil." "Civil," another resident shouted. "You fined my mother for leaving her recycling bin out overnight, but you bulldozed a shoreline without permits." More applause. Marjorie looked down, flustered. Then came Brittany Tran, the reporter who'd been covering this from the beginning. She stood up near the aisle, recorder in hand. "Ms. Klein, did the board knowingly bypass the County Floodplain Act and move forward with mechanical dredging before receiving state-level clearance?" Marjorie hesitated. "Our understanding was that the project fell within community maintenance parameters." "That's not an answer," Brittany pushed. Someone near the front row shouted, "Answer the question." It was crumbling faster than I expected. But what came next surprised even me. A woman I didn't recognize stood up near the back, mid-40s, short brown hair, glasses. She held up a thick folder. "My name is Rachel Delaney," she said clearly. "I was a temporary admin for the HOA last summer, hired to digitize records. I have here copies of 2 permit rejection notices from the County Water Board, dated 6 weeks before the dredging started." The room went silent. Rachel continued. "They were addressed to Marjorie Klein and the board, and I have email logs showing they read and chose to ignore those warnings." Gasps, then shouting. Marjorie paled. Those weren't official rejections. They were preliminary concerns. Then why didn't you share them with the community?" Rachel asked. No answer. A hand rose near the stage. It was the town's emergency response coordinator, Officer Leland Myers, in uniform. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "if you knowingly proceeded with activity flagged by the county as environmentally unsafe, and it led to flood damage that could constitute criminal negligence under state code. The auditorium erupted. People surged forward, not violently, but with fury, with righteousness. They wanted answers. They wanted resignations. Some wanted blood. It took the intervention of deputies to keep order, but it was already too late. The dam of trust had broken. The next morning, the headlines read, Echo Glen HOA. Under fire for illegal dredging and flood negligence. Internal documents suggest foreknowledge of risk. Public outcry mounts. That day, Evelyn called. You were smart to stay in the back, she said. The court of public opinion is handling most of the prosecution already. Any word from the state attorney? Yes. They're opening an investigation. The charges might include environmental violations, misappropriation of dues, and civil endangerment. Good, I said quietly. But the fury didn't end there. Residents began organizing. Online groups popped up like spring mushrooms. Echo Glen flood victims fixed the lake, and the one that gained the most traction. Disband the board. In less than a week, more than 60% of homeowners signed a petition for a vote of no confidence in the HOA's leadership. It was unprecedented, and thanks to a little-known clause in the original HOA charter, one I helped write during the community's formation, a two-thirds majority could trigger a special election and force a full board replacement. Marjorie tried to hold on. She appeared on local access TV, claiming the board had been misled by contractors and overwhelmed by conflicting data. But nobody believed her anymore. They'd seen the videos, the photos, the lake. The truth was visible from their kitchen windows and backyards, where the water lines still stained their fences and garden beds. The final blow came from Diane. The County Department of Environmental Protection issued an official statement. The Echo Glen Homeowners Association is under active investigation for violations of the Water Resources Preservation Act. Unpermitted dredging, illegal material disposal, and misrepresentation of compliance have contributed to catastrophic environmental damage. After that, Marjorie resigned. No press conference, no final email. Just a typed notice posted to the community board. She moved out 2 weeks later. I watched her go from my porch, Hank at my side, mug of black coffee in hand. No satisfaction. No bitterness. Only a strange, quiet sadness. Because once upon a time, she could have done the right thing. She just chose not to. And now the neighborhood she tried to control was finally taking itself back. One voice at a time. The silence after Marjorie resigned was unnerving. Not because it was peaceful, but because it was full of intention. A kind of focused, heavy quiet that usually comes before reconstruction or revolution. People weren't just angry anymore. They were organizing. The town, once governed by an invisible layer of rules whispered into place by the HOA, was now finding its own voice, and it was louder, clearer, and backed by law. Within 48 hours of her resignation, the County Environmental Task Force arrived in Echo Glen. Their trucks lined the West Access Road like a convoy, white vans with seal logos, temporary fencing, portable testing labs. Men and women in field vests moved with quiet urgency, taking soil samples, measuring groundwater displacement, flying drones over the lake's surface. It wasn't just inspection anymore. It was evidence collection, and I was right in the middle of it. The new acting HOA president, an interim appointee named Paul Hendrick, called me the same morning the task force set up shop. Paul was a mild-mannered man in his 60s, a retired math teacher who'd never wanted a leadership role but had been pushed forward by the residents after the mass board resignation. "I'm over my head, Dan," he said plainly. "They're asking for original design specs, culvert diagrams, historical runoff, data. I don't even know what half of this stuff means." "You don't have to," I told him, "but I do." That afternoon, I walked into the old meeting hall, the only remaining section of the clubhouse still standing. The room had been cleared out, and in its place stood folding tables covered in topographical maps, weather records, and preliminary flood simulations. FEMA officials nodded politely when I introduced myself. The county hydrologist recognized me immediately. "Daniel West," she said. "I read your initial reports. I thought you were retired." I replied. But the lake pulled me back in. She smiled. "Good. Because frankly, you're the only one here who seems to understand what actually happened. We got to work. Over the next week, I became part of the town's newly formed Lake Recovery Task Force, a joint effort between FEMA, the county, and resident representatives. Every morning I showed up with Hank a stack of notes and a thermos of coffee. We discussed everything from sediment repair to aquifer bleed risk, from wetland restoration to the feasibility of engineered backflow regulators. It was exhausting, and it was glorious. Because after months of shouting into the void, I was finally being heard. Even Evelyn showed up one morning, clipboard in hand and fire in her eyes. I filed the first wave of civil suits today, she told me, handing me a list of names. Top of the list, the dredging contractor. Second, Marjorie. Third, the HOA itself. They'll fight it, I said. Let them. I've already got 6 plaintiffs and a dozen witness statements, plus your footage and Rachel Delaney's documents. The lawsuits weren't the only thing moving fast. The town council had now stepped in, not just to supervise, but to reclaim oversight of Echo Glen's infrastructure decisions. A public vote was scheduled for the end of the month to determine whether the HOA would retain its existing legal authority or be reduced to a non-binding advisory role. For the first time since its creation, the HOA faced the possibility of being stripped of power. And the people weren't just ready. They were hungry for it. I attended a follow-up town forum that week. This time I wasn't in the back row. Paul asked me to speak on behalf of the Recovery Task Force. I wore a clean, button-up left Hank at home and stood before a packed gymnasium under the warm, yellow light of a school auditorium bulb that buzzed faintly like applause waiting to happen. I've lived here for 25 years, I began. I helped design the original retention systems that protected this community long before a board of neighbors decided they were landscape experts. A few chuckles, a few nods. I warned them when they started dredging. Not because I'm a troublemaker, but because water doesn't care about landscaping brochures. It follows physics. It follows gravity. And if we ignore that, it will always remind us. Silence. I looked out across the room. Familiar faces changed faces. People I'd passed 100 times on morning walks, but never spoken to. Now they listened. This isn't about revenge, I continued. This is about remembering what happens when small decisions get made behind closed doors, without science, without transparency, and without respect for the land we live on. Applause broke out, sustained, genuine. And for the first time, I felt something shift, not in the lake, but in the town. That night, Paul handed me a letter from the mayor's office, a formal request to serve as a consultant during Echo Glen's environmental remediation. Paid part-time. No politics, just purpose. I took it. The next few days were filled with back-to-back fieldwork. I helped map new runoff paths. We identified places where backfill could be safely removed. I worked with local university students studying environmental science, kids with fresh eyes and notebooks full of questions. And when we drilled new piezometers along the floodplain, I was the one who marked the safe lines in red. One morning I stood with Diane by the newly installed monitoring station at the North Bank. The sun was rising, casting a warm sheen across the water's surface. Birds had returned. The frogs were singing again. It wasn't healed, but it was breathing. "You should be proud," Diane said. I nodded. "It's not done." "No," she agreed. "But it's alive. And that's because of you." I didn't respond. I just watched the ripples glide gently outward, reaching, adjusting, recovering. And maybe like the lake, that's what we were all doing now. Adjusting, recovering, becoming something better than we were before. Because sometimes it takes a flood to show you who you really are. The lake stopped rising. It sounds simple, even anticlimactic. But after everything we had been through, the months of warnings, the shouts, the accusations, the lawsuits, the floods, there was nothing more beautiful to me than still water. No brown foam. No hiss of escaping gas from beneath the sediment. No biting, metallic smell carried on the wind. Just silence. Stillness. And in that silence, the work of restoration truly began. The first step was removing the fill. The gravel and limestone the HOA had dumped into the lake during their reckless attempts to fix the damage had formed artificial berms, creating pressure pockets in the lake bed. County crews working under our advisement deployed suction dredges to remove it, not to deepen the lake again, but to undo what should never have been done. I stood on the shoreline with a group of college volunteers as they marked silt lines dragging core samplers into the shallows. One of them, a kid named Luis, held up a clear cylinder of black sediment with the reverence of someone holding a sacred artifact. "This is all from the bottom layer," he asked. I nodded. "That layer hasn't seen sunlight in over 100 years. We brought it up by force." He studied the swirling patterns. "It smells like sulfur in history." That made me chuckle. I didn't plan to become a mentor in this process. But over time, I found myself guiding more than just soil studies. These young volunteers asked questions with real hunger. How watersheds worked, what a retention basin was, why wetlands mattered, and most of all, how to prevent this kind of disaster in the future. I told them what no one had told the HOA. You can't rush nature into behaving. Meanwhile, the lawsuits began to land like summer hail. The dredging company, found to be operating with expired certifications, faced $2.2 million in penalties, including environmental damages and restoration costs. Marjorie Klein, after weeks of hiding behind lawyers, was named directly in a civil suit filed by 10 residents whose homes had been compromised during the flood. She finally emerged with a formal statement, a 3-minute carefully worded video apology broadcast on the local news. But it was too little too late. Public sympathy had already swung the other way. Toward the gardeners who lost entire seasons of crops. Toward the elderly couple whose foundation collapsed mid-evacuation. And somehow, toward me. I never asked for that part. But at the next town event, a small ceremony held on the lake's northern pier to celebrate the beginning of the wetland restoration project, the new mayor handed me a certificate of civic service and a plaque that read, "Daniel West, for preserving what others tried to destroy." It felt surreal. As a man who had once been ridiculed at town meetings, dismissed as that guy with the binders and threatened with legal action, I now found myself embraced as a steward of the lake, a voice of reason, a caretaker. And yet, I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was something else entirely: responsibility. Because even though the worst was behind us, there were still wounds that wouldn't heal so easily. Families still displaced, insurance claims denied, gardens lost, trust fractured. That's why when the idea came up for a community environmental center, I didn't hesitate. It began as a conversation over coffee with Paul Hendrick and a few neighbors. Someone had joked, if only we had someone like Dan to teach people how all this works. I said, why not? We pitched the idea to the town, a lakeside center, where residents could learn about water cycles, erosion, responsible land use, and environmental resilience. We envisioned school field trips, citizen science workshops, even gardening classes centered around sustainable irrigation. The town council approved the proposal unanimously. By fall, we had a temporary building erected on the bluff overlooking the lake. Volunteers painted the walls. Local artists donated murals. We named it the Echo Glen Stewardship Center. And I was asked to be its first director. I accepted. On opening day, I gave a short speech not with a microphone, just my voice carried over the water and through the trees. This lake is not a backdrop, I said. It's not decoration, it's alive. It listens and it remembers. I looked out at the crowd, children seated on the grass, parents in lawn chairs, the same neighbors who once watched me, with suspicion, now watching with respect. When we ignore the land, it warns us. And if we don't listen, it corrects us. I paused, eyes drifting to the water. We paid for that lesson. Let's not forget it. The applause was soft, sincere. After the ceremony, Hank and I took our usual walk along the newly restored trail. The air smelled cleaner now, like pine and damp earth. Wildlife had begun to return, turtles basking on sun-warmed rocks, herons gliding low across the surface, even a pair of otters spotted near the inlet. It wasn't perfect, but it was coming back, and so were we. One afternoon, as I reviewed lake temperature readings with a local student intern, Rachel Delaney approached me. She had a binder under one arm and a shy smile. "I never got to thank you," she said. for what I asked, for standing up when I didn't know I was allowed to. She handed me the binder, her compiled testimony records, and email logs. If you hadn't come forward, I probably would have stayed silent. I took it gently. You spoke when it mattered most, I said. That's all any of us can do. She stayed and helped with water sampling that day. The restoration would take years, maybe a decade. Some species wouldn't come back. Some families had already moved away, unable to deal with the aftermath. But Echo Glen wasn't doomed. It was transforming. I thought about that each night as I stood on my porch, Hank beside me watching the water reflect the changing sky. I thought about how the lake had nearly been turned into a monument to human arrogance and how it had refused. It had risen. It had taken back what was its. But now, through care and humility, we were beginning to give something back, and for the first time in a long time that felt like redemption. The water was calm that morning. Not still, never still, but calm in the way that only a place with history can be. The wind moved across its surface, gently, sending slow ripples toward the shoreline, as if nature itself was sighing in relief. I stood at the edge of the rebuilt dock, coffee in one hand, Hank at my heel, watching the lake breathe. A year had passed since the flood. A year since the dredging, the warnings, the collapse. Echo Glen was no longer the same neighborhood it had been before. It was quieter in some ways, louder in others. The fences had come down figuratively and literally. People waved now, stopped to ask questions. Children played near the shoreline again, but with new signs posted beside them: protected wetland, no entry beyond this point. They respected the water now, because it had taught them. The Stewardship Center had grown beyond anything I imagined. What started as a temporary trailer now stood as a permanent building, timber-framed, open-windowed, filled with models of watershed systems, live feeds from underwater lake cameras, and a team of volunteers who gave weekend tours and hands-on workshops. I still worked there part-time. Most days, I led early morning sessions lessons on erosion filtration, native species planting. Some days, I just listened. The best part was hearing the kids describe the lake in their own words. It's like the lake has feelings, one of them had told me. I nodded. Maybe it does. As part of our final restoration effort, we invited local schools to plant a memory garden along the north bank. It wasn't for beauty, it was for balance. Native reeds, pollinator shrubs, flowering swamp milkweed. Every species had a purpose. Every root held the shoreline in place. Each student planted a single stem, and every one of them left a note tied to a small wooden stake beside it, what they'd learned, what they'd felt, what they'd promised to do better. I read them sometimes. They reminded me why I fought so hard. One simply said, "Dear Lake, sorry they hurt you. We'll protect you now." It made me cry the first time I saw it. Sometimes people ask if I forgave the HOA. It's a strange question, and it depends what they mean. Do I forgive the arrogance, the stubbornness, the reckless need to control something they didn't understand? Maybe not completely. But do I forgive the people? Yes. Because people aren't static. They move like water. They reshape. They overflow. They retreat. They learn. Marjorie left Echo Glen shortly after the lawsuit settled. Her house sold to a young couple who now host native birdwatching walks on weekends. I never heard from her again, and I don't need to. She learned her lesson. The town did too. And me, I never thought I'd be the guy with a plaque on a wall. I never wanted my name carved into stone or printed in brochures. I just wanted the lake to be safe. I wanted someone to listen when the ground began to shake. But I learned something too. I learned that not every fight is won with noise. Sometimes it's won with patience, with persistence, with knowing deep in your bones that what you're defending is worth the bruises, the mockery, the silence that comes before the shift. I kept every photo, every report, every flyer they used to try and discredit me. Not for vengeance, but for teaching. Because this will happen again. Somewhere else to someone else. And when it does, they'll need to know they're not alone. That what they're fighting for, whether it's a lake, a wetland, a field of trees, is real and worth it, even when the whole world says otherwise. And the last thing we restored was the trail. The one that circles the lake from the West Bluff to the community orchard. The same trail where I first noticed the soil shifting. The same one I walked after the flood, knee-deep in mud, calling out to neighbors in the dark. We laid crushed granite this time, not concrete. Soft forgiving. It curves now, with the land not against it. And along the way, we place markers, simple wooden signs with small brass plates, each etched with a lesson. Listen to the land before you speak for it. A broken system can still be rebuilt. Water remembers. One of the last signs sits right by the overlook, where the light hits the water just right in the late afternoon. It says, "A mistake isn't the end unless you ignore it." People stop there often. I do too. Hank's muzzle is white now. He moves slower, but his eyes are the same watchful, steady. We walk that trail every evening. And when we reach the overlook, he lies down and I sit beside him. And we just listen. To the frogs, to the wind, to the soft hush of the water, moving always like memory. Echo Glen changed forever. And that's a good thing. Because what rose with the flood wasn't just water. It was truth. And from that truth came redemption, healing, and a kind of peace I never thought possible. I look at the lake now and see more than just the surface. I see what lies beneath, what always did, what always will. Because this wasn't just about property lines or permits or HOA meetings. It was about listening. And finally, they did.